Welcome to the Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Wilner. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Jessi Gold. Dr. Gold is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, chief wellness officer of the University of Tennessee, and author of the new book, How Do You Feel? In a minute, she'll tell us all about it. But first, a word from our sponsor, locumstory.com. Locumstory.com is a free, unbiased educational resource about locum tenens. It's not an agency. Locum Story answers your questions on their website, podcast, webinars, videos, and they even have a Locums 101 crash course. Learn about locums and get insights from real life physicians, PAs, and NPs at locumstory.com. And now to my guest. Welcome, Dr. Jessi Gold.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Dr. Gold, I guess by way of disclosure, I should mention that your office is a stone's throw from mine at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, even though we've actually never met in person.
I know that's probably bad. I think that just shows that I travel too much around the state and that I've only been here like just under a year. But I do need to get probably food recommendations and things like that from you. I bet you know Memphis really well.
Well, I've been here now 8 years, so
Yeah.
I'm learning. There are
Yeah.
food trucks on Tuesdays,
Yeah.
right in front, and there's some better more elaborate options, let's say, also in the city. But we do need to meet in person. So only 1 year. Where did you come from?
I was at Washington University in St. Louis for about almost 5 years and then came here right after that. That was my first job off of residency. So I was there. I was director of wellness engagement and outreach in the psychiatry department, and I worked in the undergrad as the college psychiatrist, basically. Like a lot of my clinical work was on the undergraduate campus.
Ah, okay. And well, we'll just so now you are the chief wellness officer of the University of Tennessee, which is I'm not big on statistics, but there must be thousands of undergraduates, right? Because it's all over UT. You have any idea what the number
Yeah,
is?
it's over 62,000 for
$62,000.
yeah, for all five schools. So it's anybody who goes to any of the five schools under the University of Tennessee system that's a student. So that would be University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Chattanooga, Southern Martin, and the Health Science Center. So it makes a lot of students. And then it's about 19,000 faculty and staff, I think, but that's a secondary issue as like my main charge and focus is students.
Is UTHSC under your purview as a wellness officer?
It is, but not as like the only thing I'm doing. So it's interesting because my previous job and obviously my book is very much on healthcare worker mental health, and so I have a passion for it. I'm very excited by and interested in it, and I can very easily get pulled to do more of that than I'm probably supposed to do. But the hospital system, or all the hospitals that we work with in the city are not under my purview, and residents are outside technically for that reason. But the students who are at the health science center would be. So, we've got nurses and pharmacists and dentists and MD students and across the board, which I think is really cool. But it's a bunch of different healthcare students and what they're
Yeah, I
doing.
have the privilege of teaching medical students
Yeah.
at Regional One Health as well as residents. So the medical students would be under your purview, but not the residents.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. I mean, it's not like they're so outside my purview that I would never help, but it's just that since they're at like a hospital and not necessarily a student in the university system and the campus, it's not technically, it's kind of semantics.
Well, I don't remember when I went to medical school that there was a chief wellness officer. Is that kind of a new invention?
It's a newer invention, I suppose. I mean, I think that you'll see places like Stanford and some like Mount Sinai were some of the first that had it. It really did emerge from the health sciences and from hospital systems. So a lot of people are in these roles and they're like chief wellness officer of X hospitals and clinics, right? And so it's like the schools fall under that, but it's not the school specifically. There are less people who do this in just higher ed. So, like, I'm the first one to do it for our school system, but there aren't a lot of very, very similar examples that kind of cross multiple schools, multiple sort of levels of schooling, and also include health sciences. So, that part is more unique. Like, when I first was taking the job, I was trying to find other really similar examples so I could, have people to talk to and understand what people are going through and have learned. And I found some, but I would say they're all sort of different, and a lot of the people doing it are in the health spectrum of things only. I would say maybe it's like it definitely was a thought pre-COVID because I know that the person who's the chief wellness officer at Stanford was hired before I left training, so that would have had to be like 2017, 2016. But I think, as many things have been in the context of change in mental health needs and sort of obvious mental health needs post pandemic, there's more of a desire for a role like that places.
Right. I think in your book, you mentioned that COVID didn't only create mental health problems, but it made the ones that were there more acute, worse, basically, more
Yeah,
noticeable.
I think COVID and so many did that to so many systems, right? Like even just our systems of care, our systems of inequity, healthcare in general, distribution of supplies. I mean, all these systems that maybe had imperfections and had issues before were very much like laid to bear in the context of such an emergent volume and tragedy. And I think, in healthcare workers, our levels of burnout were at 50% pre COVID, our levels of depression higher than age match peers pre COVID, our levels of suicidal ideation higher than age match peers pre COVID. And then we have all of these sort of new stressors to our job, right? Like we have a disease we don't know how to manage. We have more death than we've ever had before. We don't have proper like protective equipment and supplies. We could get our family sick. We could get sick. Healthcare workers were dying. All of that was like a new sort of added compounding stressor that made what was already there crack and get worse. I think people really, the ones that haven't thought about this problem until it was pretty obvious during COVID think that now that COVID is lessened, that they can say, well, it's going to be better now. But I sort of am under the opinion, and a lot of the people who do this kind of work are, that it was bad before COVID made it worse. It's going to stay. It's not that COVID created it.
A few years ago, during COVID, I interviewed Dr. Bell, who is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Tennessee. And what we talked about was how COVID made existing problems worse by eliminating a lot of the support systems. For example, if you had something as simple as going to AA meetings, all of a sudden you can't go to AA meetings anymore, and
Yeah.
because you can't socialize. And or people with pre-existing OCD, now there really is a germ. So
Mhm.
whatever your anxiety was, there's good reason to make it worse. I mean, in every way, just if you had a problem, it made it worse.
Yeah, or
Um,
anxiety comes from not having control. And I can think of nothing you have less control over than a global pandemic. And I think that sort of like air of uncertainty is pretty obvious in most people, where kind of everybody had this like growing baseline anxiety as a result. But if you already had it, it was much worse. Like I got a lot of questions like, is this the pandemic or am I actually
mm,
anxious? Right. And it's hard to tease apart, but it is about like severity and time course and all of that stuff. But I do think it brought it out in people that maybe it wouldn't have before. But it also, if you had it and you had coping skills, maybe those coping skills couldn't be put to use, like socializing ones or ones that require you to go outside or be, doing things in nature that maybe you couldn't go do right away, or you were trapped and maybe you have fears of being inside for whatever reason too. And then, so your coping skills have to change. But on top of that, also just like this like air of there's this thing that keeps going on that I can't stop that makes things worse. And, as a psychiatrist, I felt pretty ineffective in that
mm.
setting just because, for me, like I can't medicate away the pandemic. And I felt like a lot of what people were experiencing, as a psychiatrist, like I see people for medication and do therapy at the same time. And I just felt like I have seen meds work and I was not seeing them work. Like it was just, I felt very much like these stories are just not going to change anytime soon. Like, how do I help people through that? And how can a medication help in this setting? And I had to really recognize that being there for people and even just being an outlet for people does more than I realized. I
Mm.
think that, being a being in sort of the medical profession where I have a medical model of, here's the thing, you give a treatment, people get better. And I was trained in that, even though I do psychotherapy and even though psychiatry is imperfect, not having the ability to have anybody really getting better, like in a clear cut way like that, was really frustrating and made me feel like I wasn't doing my job right. And I had to sort of reevaluate what doing my job right meant.
Okay, we're going to get to that in a second. But before we leave the wellness
Yeah.
officer, I want you to tell me exactly what that is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when people do jobs like this, it can look very different, but I'll tell you how I think about it. So there are 5 schools. They all have their own wellness infrastructure. In each campus, there's somebody doing mental health, meaning like there's a college counselor, there's people doing prevention and outreach, there's people doing fraternity and sorority life and community building. There's people, there's all these levels of what that looks like on each individual campus. My job is to say, every campus is unique and yet they're not. Where are we having common challenges and common successes? Where is something working on one campus that could be amplified somewhere else? Where are we all struggling with the same thing and how can we address that? What's working, what's not? What could be handled at a higher level that would help, So I kind of look at it in buckets like, to be able to know what to do, we have to first figure out what we are doing. So, a lot of what I've spent time doing this year and will continue to spend time doing is trying to get all of the data and what we do know on the campuses and try to understand like what we have been measuring and where the gaps in the measurement are and like what we know based on what we have been measuring. And at the same time, trying to also get an inventory of sorts of what we have been doing. Like, what are we teaching? Where are we teaching it? And what are the programs and how many people are in all of them? And what are we paying for? And then once you get a sense of that, being able to kind of say, okay, now what? Now what? Like, what do we need to do better? What do we need to amplify that's working somewhere else? What do we need support around this for? And a lot of what I do is sort of like silo break and have a bird's eye view on this conversation because you'll notice like a lot of redundancy. I would say like a lot of different silos kind of hitting this topic of wellness because by definition, it's 8 dimensions, quite broad, not just mental health, right? It's physical health, it's spiritual, it's community building or social health, it's occupational, right? Like there's a lot of different dimensions in that can span different departments. And so you can get a lot of redundancy in these things and like people kind of reinventing the wheel. I saw that a lot in healthcare where you'd be in one department, they'd say, we're doing this. And then you'd go in another and they say, oh, we're thinking of trying this. And you're like, well, did you ever talk to neurology? Because they're already doing that, right? Like they just don't communicate like that. So I have the ability to step back and sort of hear all those conversations and put all the people in the room, which I think is nice. I also have the ability to be in rooms and point out that things affect wellness when maybe other people might not think about that. So if you're in a room and someone's thinking about a policy or somebody's thinking about investing in something or somebody's thinking about like legal things about something that might be mental health related, it's helpful to have somebody who actually thinks about this all the time and has a background in it and isn't just in higher ed and has seen people as patients, but also is able to say like, hey, have you thought about how flexible work might impact people's mental health or how the things that we think about with family leave might affect somebody's well-being and retention and recruitment in a job and sort of like trying to be a voice of like linking all of that because I think in so many ways people pick schools, people pick jobs for these reasons now. And so you want to be a leader in that, but you also do want to care about that. And so picking me to be in a job like this allows our system, our institution to really center it as a primary value, but in doing that, making sure that it is sort of like in the ethos of all that we're doing.
I need a little bit of a history lesson.
Sure.
And because when I go back, this was admittedly a very long time ago, and some of the memories may have been corrupted over time. But as a medical student and resident, I don't remember anyone being concerned about my wellness except maybe my parents.
Yeah.
The institution certainly did not take responsibility for my wellness. I was mostly miserable, as I recall. I enjoyed studying all the time, which kind of made up for it. And when I expressed that to my colleagues and peers, and pretty much the response was, "Well, of course you are." I mean, you're supposed to be. And that's what I tell the residents. Like, if you're not miserable, you're not doing it right because you were supposed to put every ounce of energy into your work. There was no such thing as work-life balance.
Yep.
And so here's something maybe provocative. So I'm wondering whether the whole concept of work-life balance it creates a stress
Sure.
because I think you and I would agree, at least in our roles, that work life balance is pretty much impossible, right? It's a moving target and achieving it. Every now and then, there's 5 minutes during a day where I got it. I achieved work life balance. Everything is flowing just the way it should.
Hmm.
As I say, that often lasts no more than 5 minutes. And then it's back to being a constant state of imbalance, I would say. So if you think that work life balance is an achievable goal, then you're going to be disappointed a lot of the time. All right. So, two questions.
Hmm.
When did the institution decide that it was their responsibility to provide or create an atmosphere of wellness? And are our expectations, in part, our current expectations of work life balance, responsible for a lot of the stress that I see in residents and students who are working much less hard and many less hours than we used to?
So the answer to your first question is probably a mix between like Libby Zion case and the need for duty hours due to like the evidence that overwork and like working while not sleeping is the same as working while intoxicated. And so as we had data that that wasn't good and we looked at duty hours and what we were doing, that became more of a conversation because if we could hurt patients by not having work life balance by not sleeping, then that's a problem, right? So I think, the person in the Libby Zion case was a resident and missed diagnosing serotonin syndrome. And so I think that that prompted obviously a lawsuit, which prompts lots of things to happen in our culture, but was probably an impetus for the conversation. I'd say the sort of second wave comes from accreditation bodies. So in medical school accreditation, they have requirements about like students having to have access to care and being able to do that during the workday and having time to do that. They also have requirements around education around like well-being and taking care of themselves. And so they've put them into accreditation standards, and some of it could be passed off somewhat as a checkbox, and you'll see that some places, like sometimes, like not here, but I have been, brought in for grand rounds places where you can tell that people think that the only thing they're getting is me coming to talk, right? They're like, oh, good. They solved it with Jessi coming for 1 hour. That's all we needed, right? And so I think that's schools would have less of a desire to care if that was the case. I do think too, like as the younger generation just simply cares about that and what they're looking for, that medicine, in order to survive, also needs to find a way to balance this desire for some semblance of caring for yourself and at the same time recognizing we have certain sort of like professional obligations that are different than other careers. And so I think some of that's recruitment and retention into medicine too. Some people would maybe argue that because medicine looks very different than what it did 60, 70 years ago in terms of demographics and stuff like that, that some of the push came from there too, right? So more women, more people who need to be able to balance like having kids and doing the job and not all dropping out of the job. And so what does that look like? You need more flexibility. You don't want to lose every woman when they have a kid, right? I mean, we're not great at that yet, like if you look at the data, but I think that probably contributed as well. And then your kind of question about what that does to the field and is an added stressor. I mean, I do think that I hear that a lot. I think there's a significant tension between the folks that are coming up through training and what they hope medicine will be and what they think it can become in terms of work-life balance, and what sort of like the people who have experienced in their past and don't understand how it could possibly become that. And sort of like there's a generation of trainers and teachers who are like those people are sensitive and weak. What's wrong with them? Then there's a generation of the younger folks who are like, those people are outdated and don't get it and don't respect me and the things that I need to make me happy, right? So, really strong, different sides of this argument. And I see it create a ton of tension in sort of asks that they're getting for accommodations or sort of like requests to go to a like appointment or something like that, whatever. It can cause a lot of distress and like a lot of people saying like, oh, you just don't get it, and you, what do you know, or you're wimpy, suck it up. And it causes a lot of tension. I do think that'll be the case for a while until something gives. I don't know what the thing that gives is going to be. I think the problem in medicine is there are a lot of things that have always been bad for our work-life balance and how we're treated as humans, but we haven't created systems solutions to them. So even now, like that, we maybe have data and recognize that they're bad and that maybe we should improve upon them. The systems that are preventing us from improving upon them are maybe not as obvious to trainees. And I think there's a frustration there, right? Which is like, why am I doing this? And then we say, well, what are you going to do? Like, we don't have anybody to work if you're not working. Where's the redundancy going to come from? Where are the hours going to come from? Like, I think you see a lot of people in different programs, younger folks like unionizing. And I think that that has happened as sort of an attempt to regain some control in a thing where we don't actually have that much control because a lot of other systems do. But the way that comes off to the folks who are already trained is like, well, if you're unionized, like all your work is going to go to me. I already did that. I don't want your work, right? And so I think it's a very complicated thing because to really like find a solution that answers like how to have work-life balance in medicine, a lot of systems have to change. And also some folks who might have already worked hard might have to work hard a little longer in some sort of in-between generation flux to fix it. And I don't know that we have a culture that wants to do that because I think we've always had a culture that's like, well, it gets better. It doesn't really get better. It really like gets different, but we think it gets better. And so we're like, oh, we're not doing that again. I already did that. I'm done with call or whatever, right? And so that's a long-winded answer to say it's a big, big challenge. And I've been asked almost every time I give a talk, like some version of, do you think wellness has been weaponized? Or do you think, like, what's wrong with them? Like, why are they so sensitive? Like, one of those two things I get asked almost every time. And there's not a perfect answer, right? Like, I don't know that I think they're sensitive. I think that they're just more aware and they have the, like, language and understanding that that's not good for them and that they don't want to put up with that. It doesn't mean that the system is going to get that and change, but I think they have more awareness and more sort of cultural ability to talk about that out loud than some of us did. So I don't know that they're like extra sensitive in that setting, but I do think that like if you're a person looking down and saying like, oh, they're asking for so much and I can't give any of that, and like the things that they're asking for are impossible and they just can't make sense in medicine, like I can see where you go like it's being weaponized because obviously that's like a strong stance, but if you feel like you can't help people and they ask and ask for a lot, but you just can't help, you also feel helpless, and that doesn't contribute well to your own well-being. And so I think it probably has repercussions just being like, I don't know how to help, and I don't feel like I'm satisfying what they want, and like I'm not sure I can. And sometimes I just tell folks like, we need to be more honest about that because if you've never been in administration, you've never seen the 17 layers of stuff we have to do to like have someone cover a shift or, like just this
Hmm.
stuff that doesn't make any sense. But you're just like, well, why can't I take off for my dad's wedding? Well, here are the 17 things that have to happen for you to do that, right? Like, it's not that I don't hear you and respect why you want to go there, but like, help me figure out how to get you there in the context of this. And like, we have to be more honest about how badly messed up our system is because it's not that we don't get it. It's just that we can't do it. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. And before we leave the wellness topic, I think we can both put in a plug for UTHSC, which does take this problem pretty seriously. I know in our neurology program, there is a person responsible for wellness, and there are activities, and there's protected time, and a lot of things at the cost of the protected time of faculty, I might add. There's protected time for the residents, but there is definitely an acknowledgement and a willingness and some results in terms of executing programs to improve the wellness of the students and residents. So I think I always like to give credit where credit is due,
Sure,
one
sure.
way or the other. So it's nice to be able to say something positive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everywhere can do things better. I think I'm glad to work places that care. I think that sometimes the places that care end up caring because of bad outcomes. Just like I said, sort of, we cared in medicine about duty hours because of a lawsuit. Like sometimes somebody dies or something, and then it's an issue. And then you see these enormous investments in how do you support our wellness. And I get mad about that. Like one of the reasons I got excited about this job was that I wasn't like called in after something bad happened to be like the savior, because you're either a savior or a scapegoat, and either way you're in a really bad setup. Like you might get a lot of resources because they're scared and pumping them into you, but you're somehow like coming into, fixing everything. Or, well, if it's not fixed, well, we hired Jessi. Like, why isn't she doing it? Right. So I was glad that sort of the impetus was a more like, this might be a problem in the future. And we're being more thoughtful about prevention and the need for this in like sort of paying attention to the national landscape than like, oh, right now, in this crisis, we need somebody now. Please be that person, Jessi. Because I don't like that. Like I could do that fine, sure, and maybe I'd like the resources. I don't, but it doesn't set you up for success in any way.
All right. Well, now that we've set the stage, let's talk about how do you feel? So, how did that happen? And before we before we started recording, I asked you what kind of book is it? So tell me about that. What kind of book is
Yeah,
it?
I mean, I always say it's like a different take on a memoir. Like it is a memoir, like you get my story, but my story also is the story of patients, is the story of our field and the culture within it. And so, it's part memoir, part patient narrative, part research. And, it tends to fall in the memoir side because it's much more memoir or nonfiction, like creative nonfiction, than it is self-help. Like there is self-help in there. Like I have conversations with my therapist, my I have conversations with my patients. You could resonate and take tips and tricks from that, but it's more like secret self-help. I'm not like, here is what burnout means, this is what you do for burnout. It's more like, let's talk about this in the context of me and a patient and see what you think and what did we do, and maybe that'll work for you too. So the book is, how did it come about? I had been doing research and some academic related things for healthcare worker mental health for a long time. My thesis my master's thesis for anthropology was on pre-med as a culture. So I've always been really interested in how we train people, why we train them that way, why the people who seemed like they would be such good doctors were like dropping out in college, and how that kind of continued in the way that we educate and the values we prioritize and the things that we're selecting for. And, in the context of the pandemic, I was a psychiatrist at home seeing healthcare workers virtually. I burned out pretty badly myself and was listening to story after story after story that was similar, but yet every single person thought that nobody was experiencing it.
Mm.
And they were all coming in pretty sick because they were waiting until it was almost interfering with work. And I kind of just got to the point where I was like, I think this is like the tipping point in this conversation. Like, we need to have it, and we need to have it publicly. And, you know, it just happens to center around that time period because, again, like we kind of mentioned, like it just made things worse. But it just felt like the time to write it for me, whether that was because I burnt out or because of what I was hearing and feeling. It just felt like we were in a moment where that conversation needed to be had.
Well, I read the book and I thought it's a great read and it's very interesting and it's not your typical book. There's a lot of I would say self-reveal, right, about you that I'm not sure that I'm sure that not every physician would be comfortable with.
For sure.
How did you decide, well, this is what I can say about my parents or my therapist or my dating life or how,
Yeah.
was there like a red line somewhere?
Yeah.
How did you sort of decide that?
It's a really good question. Psychiatry takes self-disclosure to like another level. I mean,
Mm.
people who work in mental health, like Freud, very much believed that like we were supposed to be mirrors reflecting the patient in the room, and we didn't have like pictures of our family in our office, and we didn't talk about ourselves at all. And so psychiatry has evolved some, and so has therapy in the context of the behavioralists and the folks that do cognitive behavioral therapy, and those kind of models are a bit more self-revealing. The folks that have lived experiences and do substance use work are a bit more self-revealing, and we've seen where it can be beneficial. But I would say sort of the older school, long-standing academic model in mental health is not to talk about it. And so you would think like, well, you would at least have support there. So I'll start with saying that mental health fields are not as supportive in this as you would think that they would be, because
Mm.
we should be more than probably other medical fields because it's just not that common in medicine in general. But we're not. So for me, I dabbled with self disclosure both in social media and early sort of narrative writing and popular press writing, and would keep in mind like when I was younger I was a lot more hesitant to share because I was still in training and I wasn't sure what I felt comfortable sharing or what I even felt like people should know about me. And so I erred on the side of like caution, trying to be myself but not overly sharing in a way where I couldn't take it back, and sort of tiptoed into that to see what people's reactions were, how I felt, what it was like with patients knowing that. And like over time, I always say, like before I say anything on social, before I write anything, like what would it be like for my patients to know that? And what's the point of my patients knowing that? I'm not sharing for sharing's sake. There's things about my story that I don't think I owe anyone and will probably never tell, but maybe it makes my story a little more boring because you don't get all the juicy details about growing up, or you don't get all the juicy details about what brought me into, see a psychiatrist for the first time, or, things like that. I chose what I felt I would want a patient to know and why. For me, this is the most I've revealed in anything that I've done, especially in like bulk, because it's much more memoir than I thought. And I did have to push back some with editors and stuff and say like, nope, I'm not going more into that. That's all you get. This is how I feel. I feel comfortable here. I'm not moving that line. It's not a clear cut, yes, this information, no, this information, but more sort of like, okay, in the context of this, like, would I want a patient to bring that into like a conversation with me, and what would that be like? With my parents and my family, I didn't want it. What the purpose of the book is not to diss my family in any capacity. I love my family. Everybody does something wrong, like, so I wasn't trying to write a book like that. And so the purpose of talking at all about my childhood was to talk about perfectionism and overachieving and where I got that from. And so I wrote those parts and sent them to the family members who would care that it was out there, and said, this is what I'm thinking. It's pretty watered down. I'm overly cautious about what's going out there about you and all that. Like, what do you think about this? And they gave a little feedback, and I changed some things, and that's how I did those chapters. My therapist did not want to see the chapters that she's in. we had a lot of conversations about me writing about her while I was still seeing her in general, because that's all kind of like complex and layered. But what she really said to me was like, I am not a writer. I didn't want to do something publicly, but I understand why in the context of what you're trying to tell in the story that you're trying to tell, it's inauthentic and unhelpful for you not to be getting treatment yourself. I just happen to be your treater, and that's how she viewed it. And so for me, that was really helpful. And I kept trying to be like, you pick your name, or like, you read these chapters. And she'd be like, what? I don't want to be able to read anything when I can change it. She's like, it's your story. I don't deserve the right to change that, but like, I appreciate that you keep asking me. And, sometimes I'll joke like, oh, you're just going to drop me as a patient because I wrote this like creepy, overly flattering story about you. And she's like, I mean, it's very kind, but it's not creepy. You asked me about it a lot, and I know like who you are, and it doesn't feel boundary breaking because we had so many conversations about it. And so yeah, I mean, it's very layered to tell like personal stories when you are a clinician. It's very layered as a sister and a daughter, and it's very layered as a patient. So I think trying to balance all that was really important. And at the same time, really, I wrote composite patients because I wanted to protect my patients more than anything. So much so that I even got consent and sent a lot of chapters to some people who might have not liked that I used one story from them, and they would recognize that one story was theirs. Because, I'm a psychiatrist. Like, if you don't trust me, my meds don't work. My whole everything doesn't work. It's all about the relationship. And so, it's really important to me that people don't feel like, oh, I'm going to see that psychiatrist who writes and she's going to write about me. Like, that's gross. I don't ever want to be someone like that. And so, it was really important to make composite patients and make sure that, they do have elements of certain people, but they're like, their identities disguised enough that they're multiple patients enough that like not one thing is the exact story of one person, because like I don't want, even if it technically doesn't violate HIPAA, because I didn't like say their name and demographics and whatever counts there. Like sometimes patients still go, but you said that to me in that exact way, and we had that exact story, and that thing happened to me. They know it's them. Like no one else will, but they'll know that you got that from them. And so it was really important to me that like people felt safe having talked to me too. So as much as like my disclosure mattered and how I thought about that from a clinician's perspective and all the other roles and hats I play, the sort of role of like how to use patients was also very much on my mind, because I've never really done a lot of patient narrative, and I really, the relationship is everything. And so I didn't really want to do anything to ruin that for anybody.
Wow, I can see a lot of thought went into what you did say and didn't say. And I like your overriding rule that there had to be a purpose. And I do that with the residents. If I see a patient in the hospital, and I one of the concepts I learned on my all too brief psychiatry rotation was this concept of the therapeutic alliance, right? That you and the patient have to make some kind of bond. And if you do, like you said, your medicines will work better, everything works better. So I try very hard to do that. And if they bring up an illness that I might have had, or if they're from a city that I might have lived in, or their particular favorite drink is my favorite drink, then I might add that. And it sounds just like chit chat. But I tell the residents it's like I'm not just wasting your time here. That this chit chat has a purpose,
For sure.
and very often they'll be amazed as after this little bit of chit chat, some piece of history will come out. The patient's been in the hospital for 4 days, hasn't told anybody, and then all of a sudden we find out that in fact they had exactly the same problem 20 years ago, but hadn't told anybody yet. So that there's a purpose for the sharing. I think that's a great guideline.
I mean, I wish we learned it like a skill instead of like, oh, you're not supposed to do it. Don't do that. That's bad. It's like, when is it helpful? And how can it be used in a way that benefits the patient and benefits you and your relationship to them, right? Like, we learn not to do it, so we're scared to do it, or we learn, like, oh, there are times I've been like happy that I didn't start crying because I was really proud of myself. And my therapist said, why is that good? Like, why are you happy that you didn't cry, that somebody told you their wife died, or, whatever. And I was like, well, I just didn't, I couldn't have cried in the session. It would have made it about me and it wasn't the point. And they were like, but wouldn't it just look like you had feelings and were empathetic? And it doesn't always mean that it then makes you a narcissist, you know? And so I think that, you know, some of what we're taught is helpful, and sometimes these things can be of use. Like, I don't self-disclose in every patient setting. Sure, you can Google me and you can read what you read, you can watch my social, you can read my book, you know, you can come in knowing a lot about me, but most people actually don't, which is surprising.
Hmm.
But knowing that, I know they could know, but I'm actually not going to say anything unless they bring it up or unless it's important to the conversation and can be helpful or therapeutic in some way. Like, I still treat a one-on-one session like they might know. It's okay if they know because I chose to share things that I would be okay with them knowing. But I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm going to prescribe you Wellbutrin. I take that too. High five, right? Like, that's weird. That's weird and unhelpful. But if they were like, hey, like, do you know anybody who took Wellbutrin and made it through med school? I'd say, well, I've had some patients, but I also took it myself and it was fine. You know, like, there are ways where that doesn't feel like this weird thing that you're saying and disclosing. It just feels kind and normalizing. And so I do wish we learned it like as a skill in the same way you're trying to teach it, right? Which is like, watch this. I'm not just blowing smoke. This will help you be better. And like, some of this stuff I learned in watching really good attendings and people were like, give a box of tissues like when someone cries, like these things that like they don't even know that they taught me because it was like secondhand for them, but made such a difference to how I realized like you could connect with people and you could make a difference in someone's life. It's not always, again, like as much as it sometimes feels like it needs to be, it's not always like diagnose you, treat you, make you better. It's sometimes just like being there for people and being someone who can be there for them.
So, for all of those out there listening or watching who want to know more about the personal life of Dr. Jessi Gold, where can they find your book?
If you'd like to know about my personal life, that's hilarious. So my book is most places you can get books. It's from Simon and Schuster. So if you just look up "How Do You Feel," Jessi Gold, Jessi spelled like Jessica without the CA, you can find it. Most places you buy books. If you're like a local bookstore person, they should be able to get it for you if they don't have it already. But all the big ones that ship and things that you can think of their names as I say this, you can find it there too. You know, you can also find me on social media, most outlets, and on my website for things like speaking, if that's of interest. All are just Dr. Jessi Gold or drjessigold.com. And that's where you can learn all my life story and connect with me if you want to.
All right, so we are approaching the end of our 55-minute
Whoops.
psychiatrist hour.
Sorry about that.
It's oh, that's great. Anything you would like to add?
You said you wanted to ask me about the fact that I have a gummy bear in my background.
Yes, I was curious about the green bear. I didn't realize it was edible. Is it
It's
a
not edible.
Oh,
It's an artist from Instagram. But really it's a bookend. But the reason it's back there is I was after I set up my new office, I was talking to a mentor like this, and my office had just diplomas. And she goes, your background is very serious for you, Jessi. And I was like, what do you mean?
hmm.
And she's like, it just like, I get why your diplomas go behind your desk. Like, where else are they going to go? But she's like, it just doesn't feel like you. And so I was like, how do I make my desk have like something or color or like kind of like more, you know, kind and different than just my degrees and pedigree that could go behind my desk. And so like I saw that online and I was like, that fits there. That's nice. I put it back there. So that's why it's back there. It's more of like bringing me into the degrees. So the background isn't so ah.
All right. So for those of you who are listening and not watching, there is a 6 inch by 3 inch, almost translucent green, friendly looking bear on Jesse's desk.
It's a gummy bear. You just can't eat it.
All right. Well, this has been informative and fun. And Dr. Jessi Gold, I want to thank you very much for being a guest on The Art of Medicine.
Thanks for having me.
And now a final thanks to our sponsor, locumstory.com. Locumstory.com is a free, unbiased educational resource about locum tenens. It's not an agency. Locum Story exists to answer your questions about the how-tos of locums on their website, podcast, webinars, and videos. They even have a Locums 101 crash course. At locumstory.com, you can discover if locum tenens make sense for you and your career goals. What makes locumstory.com unique is that it's a peer-to-peer platform with real physicians sharing their experiences and stories, both the good and bad, about working locum tenens. Hence the name, Locum Story. Locumstory.com is a self-service tool that you can explore at your own pace with no pressure or obligation. It's completely free. Thanks again to locumstory.com for sponsoring this episode of The Art of Medicine. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner. See you next time. This program is hosted, edited, and produced by Andrew Wilner, MD, FACP, FAAN. Guests receive no financial compensation for their appearance on The Art of Medicine. Andrew Wilner, MD, is Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Memphis, Tennessee. Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this program belong solely to Dr. Wilner and his guests and not necessarily to their employers, organizations, or other group or individual. While this program intends to be informative, it is meant for entertainment purposes only. The Art of Medicine does not offer professional financial, legal, or medical advice. Dr. Wilner and his guests assume no responsibility or liability for any damages, financial or otherwise, that arise in connection with consuming this program's content. Thanks for watching. For more episodes of The Art of Medicine, please subscribe. www.andrewwilner.com